Meet St. Thomas Aquinas. He may not look like much. In fact, his schoolmates called him the dumb ox. Yet a teacher of his knew that young Thomas was destined for great things. "We call him the dumb ox," his teacher said, "but in his teaching he will one day produce such a bellowing that it will be heard throughout the world." While Thomas was busy studying at seminary, an old threat to the church had re-emerged in Europe. An ancient evil that would bring the church to the brink of crisis. Logic. In the 13th century, a dangerous new form of thinking was quickly spreading across the universities of Europe. The ideas of Aristotle, long lost to the West, had been reintroduced to Europe by an Islamic scholar named Ibn Rushd. Europeans did not know how to pronounce this name, so they called him Averroes, and the new ideas he'd introduced, Averroism. Averroes claimed that there were two paths to the truth, one through divine revelation, like religion, and the other through the more mundane truths of logic. This sort of separation may seem natural to you and me, but we grew up in a world which distinguishes between scientific facts and religious beliefs. There was no such distinction in 13th century Europe. So what were these two paths to truth? And why did the church find this concept so alarming? To understand their concern, we need to take a quick trip back in time, about 1500 years, to classical Athens. There, two great thinkers had put forward very different views of the universe. On the one hand, there was Plato, the father of Western philosophy. On the other hand was Aristotle, Plato's upstart student. Their conflict centered around the nature of truth. For Plato, the truth was something abstract. Plato insisted that if something is true, it must always be true. You could not find truth in the world because the world is full of change and chaos. For Plato, truth resided in another place altogether, a place he called the realm of forms, a place where everything is perfect and nothing ever changes. There you might find the perfect cat, forever napping in the branches of the perfect tree. According to Plato, everything in our world is just a poor copy of that perfect place. Every cat we see is just an imitation of the perfect form of cat. All the different varieties of trees we see are the result of imperfect matter trying to fill the perfect form of tree. Therefore, whatever truth we might find in the world is bound to be just as imperfect as the world itself. Aristotle begged to differ. For Aristotle, truth was something concrete. Something doesn't have to always be true to be true in a particular. For example, when a person says, "I'm hungry," he's telling the truth. He's not telling the truth for all time. He's not always hungry, but at that particular place and that particular time, that particular person is hungry. This sort of truth wasn't in some abstract realm of forms. It was right here, in the world all around us. Where Plato wanted big truths like the perfect form of cat, or the perfect form of justice, or even the perfect form of goodness, Aristotle preferred to collect little truths like, I fell out of bed, the cat fell out of the tree, the rock fell down the mountain. Then Aristotle could use those little truths to come up with bigger truths, like things fall. So, what does a spat between two Athenian philosophers have to do with the church's crisis centuries later? Everything. You see, when early Christians were establishing their own philosophical grounding, they borrowed heavily from Plato. The idea that the truth was something inaccessible to the senses had obvious religious applications. Plato's distaste for the material world was well suited to the Christian mindset, while the realm of forms must have sounded kind of like heaven. And so, the church bound itself tightly to Platonic philosophy at an early age. To give you some concept of how entwined Platonism had become with Christianity, let's have a look at the scholarship of medieval Christians. If you were to ask a medieval scholar, why is the rose red, and why does it have thorns? The scholar would reply that the rose is red for the blood of Christ, and the thorns are there to remind us of our Lord's crucifixion. Here we can kind of see how the Christians co-opted Plato's notion of perfect forms being reflected in the material world. They just replaced perfect forms with perfect Jesus. Now let's throw Aristotle back into the world, as Ibn Rushd did. How would Aristotle answer our questions about the rose? He'd tell us to use our heads. The rose is red for the same reason all flowers are brightly colored, to attract bees. And the thorns are there to keep predators away. Duh! Imagine the fear the church must have felt at the return of this practical, no-nonsense way of looking at the world. The church had been in charge of the truth for centuries. They were the sole authority on what was true and what was not. And then here comes Aristotle, back from the dead, telling people that the truth is all around them. If they just take the time to observe and reflect on the little truths, they can reach higher truths all on their own. The church was not just frightened, it was terrified. What if Christian doctrine could not stand up to the scrutiny of Aristotelian logic? Worse yet, what if someone used this new sort of logic to prove that God didn't exist? These were the questions that kept church fathers up at night. They need not have worried, for Thomas Aquinas was there to save them. Aquinas believed that just because Aristotle was incompatible with Plato, didn't mean that Aristotle had to be incompatible with Christianity. Aquinas knew that the same logic that could be used to prove that God didn't exist could also be used to prove that God did exist. Rather than trying to refute Aristotle's logic, Aquinas used it. In fact, he improved it. Aquinas wasn't intimidated by Aristotle's logic. Indeed, Aristotelian logic was rather shoddy by Aquinas' standards. Aquinas came up with several improvements to Aristotelian logic, including the theory of supposition and the theory of consequences. These theories laid the foundations for the first-order logic we use today. With this new, refined logic at his disposal, Aquinas went about proving the existence of God, as well as defending many of the contested aspects of Christian faith, including the divinity of Christ and the nature of the Trinity. Aquinas' two greatest works, the Summa Theologica, the collection of all things theological, and the Summa Contra Gentiles, the collection of arguments against non-believers, became the new pillars which held Christianity above the challenges of skeptics and scholars. We haven't the time to explore all of Aquinas' logical defenses of Christianity. However, a single example should suffice. In his Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas makes an argument regarding the gradation of intellect. He notes that stupid people often doubt what intelligent people say is true, not because the stupid people have arguments to the contrary, but because they do not understand what the intelligent person is talking about. Aquinas compares this to mortal men talking about God. Just as an intelligent person is much smarter than an idiot, so too God is vastly more intelligent than even the smartest man. Just as it would be incredibly foolish for an idiot to insist that what an intelligent person proposes is false, simply because he cannot understand it, so too it is the acme of stupidity for a man to call divine revelation false, simply because he cannot understand it. With arguments like this at hand, the church didn't need hot irons and pincers to convert the non-believer. Aquinas' arguments were so thorough, so logical, so convincing, that any quarrelsome scholar with a logical bone to pick could be handed a copy of Aquinas and emerge fully convinced of the error of his ways. To review, Aquinas was a Christian scholar who protected the church from the threat of Aristotelian logic. The church was afraid that scholars would use this logic to disprove Christianity, just as Aristotle had used the same logic to disprove Plato centuries earlier. This panic was only heightened by the fact that so much Platonic philosophy had found its way into Christianity. Plato's lofty idealism, which had provided the church with its philosophical foundation, now proved a liability against the common-sense approach of Aristotelian logic. Aquinas turned this threat on its head. Rather than refuting Aristotelian logic, Aquinas used it and even improved upon it. Essentially, Aquinas took the sword of logic from the throat of the church and placed it firmly in her hand.